Congressman Ro Khanna, thank you so much for joining us here on Bold today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Why did you think it was important to form the War Power Caucuses now?
Well, we've seen that endless war has not been in our country's interest. We have had massive money invested in these wars, trillions of dollars. We have a budget for defense that now is 60% of the discretionary federal budget. That money should be going to education, to healthcare, to infrastructure. And this country is weary of endless wars that, by the way, don't have congressional authorization. I mean, they have this blanket AUMF back in 2002 that's still being used. So we need to speak up and say, before getting into more of these interventions, you need to come to Congress first.
So the AUMF says nothing about associated forces. So how is it that we're at war with groups that didn't exist on 9/11?
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, the AUMF in 2002, unfortunately, was worded very broadly. So it includes Al-Qaeda, and it doesn't restrict geography, and it doesn't have a time restriction. And administrations have, in some ways, been disingenuous to argue that Al-Qaeda is a threat in these other areas and use that to go to war. In fact, this administration has hinted publicly that they would use the 2002 AUMF to go to war with Iran. But what we're making clear is, one, that the 2002 AUMF doesn't apply to places like Iran. And second, it ought to be repealed because it's so broadly written that it lends itself to ambiguity.
So why doesn't it apply to Iran specifically?
Well, Al-Qaeda doesn't exist in Iran. I mean, Al-Qaeda, if anything, is supported in part by the Saudis at 9/11. And the Saudis, under the administration's own theory, are in opposition with Iran. Iran is a Shiite country. So to argue that Iran is actually supporting Al-Qaeda is just nonsensical.
Should the U.S. government support Saudi in Yemen?
I'd say not. And I led the War Powers Resolution for the first time in history. It passed the House of Representatives to stop any U.S. refueling of Saudi planes that were bombing Yemen. I mean, the situation there is catastrophic. 14 million people possibly face famine. There's not enough food and medicine going in. The Saudis have blockaded the food and medicine from getting there. The Houthis share some blame, too. I mean, the Houthis haven't allowed medicine and food to get there. But the United States, for many years, was fueling the Saudi planes that were bombing Yemen. Unfortunately, President Trump vetoed my resolution and Senator Sanders' resolution. Senator Sanders did an extraordinary job leading it in the Senate. It was actually his bill that then we passed through the House. And the president vetoed it. It was only the second time that he vetoed something. It was the first time in history that a War Powers resolution had passed. The good news is that the president voluntarily, because of the political pressure, suspended the refueling. So we're no longer refueling because of that War Powers resolution. But unfortunately, the bill resolution wasn't signed.
So you've said that prolonged overseas military presence breeds radicalization and that responsibly withdrawing makes us safer. How do you responsibly withdraw troops from Afghanistan now?
Well, we withdraw with a peace agreement, and there was a recent op-ed in the New York Times from a woman activist on human rights who said that she, in fact, believes that we could get safeguards from the Taliban when it comes to women's rights and allowing women, at the very least, to have safety and access to education. So we need to make sure that we are engaged in withdrawal with a peace agreement that respects some of the basic human rights and prevents civilian loss of life. But I don't think having a presence there is doing much, especially when we have increased our troops and the Taliban controls more of the territory. Our mission was never to get rid of the Taliban. Our mission was to get rid of Al-Qaeda, and we've been there almost 20 years. So I would leave, but I'd leave in a way that had more regional players responsible for security. They made it clear that we reserve the right to come back if Al-Qaeda posed a threat to the United States again, and then made every effort to secure women's rights.
How do you trust the Taliban, though, to preserve women's rights somewhere like Afghanistan? Because I think a lot of women in the country don't see that happening if the Taliban is to come into power in the country.
Well, it's not easy. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, the Taliban had a horrible record before we went in, but we have to weigh it with all the civilian life that has been lost because of the war. We have to weigh it with all of the trillions of dollars that have been wasted there. And then we have to look to some of these peace activists who understand the situation better than those of us in Washington, D.C. And there was a recent, I don't remember the name, but a recent leader who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and she was very eloquent, and she talked about her encouraging discussions with the Taliban in the peace agreement. So I think some progress is possible. We're going to need UN monitoring. We're going to need countries to continue to monitor the situation. But it's not going to be perfect, but it's better than a prolonged war.
So the AMF, should it be repealed completely or replaced?
Well, it should be first repealed, and then we can discuss whether there are places where we need to have military intervention, and each of those places we can debate what the authority is and why we need a true presence there. So I'm not opposed to sending counterterrorism forces overseas if Al-Qaeda really posed a threat to security. But I think each case needs to be evaluated individually, and then Congress needs to vote up or down on those individual cases.
So should the president, is there any case in which the president should have the right to use force when it's not authorized by Congress?
Yes, if it's in self-defense, I mean, which the president has under the Constitution. So if some country was going to shoot down an American ship or shoot down American forces, the president, of course, under self-defense can prevent that. And the president has, under the War Powers Act, up to 60 days to take defensive measures before having to come to Congress. But the president can't get us into endless wars or take drastic action that would escalate into a long-standing war without coming to Congress.
Would you have supported Trump's decision if he decided in retaliation to bomb Iran for them shooting down the U.S. military drone?
I would not have. That would have led to an escalation that I think would have been unwise. I think Iran is lashing out because we left the JCPOA, and what we need to do is get back into the JCPOA. That's what other countries have done. That's what Japan did. That's what has advocated, whose tanker was struck down. That's what Norway has advocated, whose tanker was struck down. So I believe it would have been a counterproductive response to strike Iran and kill civilians in response to their action against our drone.
Should the United States use military force to prevent governments hostile to the U.S. from possessing nuclear weapons?
No, I don't think that that's the right approach. If anything, I think that will accelerate those countries developing nuclear weapons. They're developing nuclear weapons because they view that as a safeguard towards regime change. They see that Pakistan has a nuclear weapon and no one is talking about overthrowing the Pakistani regime. So that countries like North Korea and Iran are in a race against time, saying if we develop nuclear weapons, we can safeguard our regime. I think the way to achieve denuclearization is not to threaten military force. It's to assure them that we have no interest in aggression or regime change, and then work towards a framework of denuclearization.
Should we have interest in regime change, though? Is democracy worth kindling overseas and preserving abroad?
Well, I have John Quincy Adams' view. I do think liberal democracy is better than authoritarian government, and America should celebrate countries that transition to liberal democracy. We should advocate for human rights and liberal democracy and encourage other countries to seek that. But we shouldn't engage in military force to try to bring that about. And John Quincy Adams, back in the 1800s, warned us that if we tried to do that, we often will get on the wrong side of a battle. You can't just impose democracy on countries, and certainly not by external force. And when we do go in with military force, often we strengthen the autocrat because he or she can rally their country around a boogeyman of Western intervention, and they don't see it as a liberation. So I am all for moving and supporting liberal democracy. I just don't think that can be achieved through military intervention.
And finally, I do want to ask you, how long would you give the president if the AUMF were to be repealed to wrap up ongoing combat operations overseas?
Well, it depends on the country. I think in the case of Afghanistan, we ought to withdraw. We ought to withdraw expeditiously and come to a peace agreement with the Taliban. I certainly wouldn't have escalated there. The president campaigned on withdrawing and getting out of Afghanistan.
And you're not worried about it leaving a vacuum there and then new terrorist organizations coming in?
I'm not. I think that we can have a regional force there under the UN. I don't think the American people signed up for a war that goes on beyond 18 years. It's the longest war in our history. And I think most Americans, if you said, do you want a continued presence in Afghanistan past 18 years that are costing us trillions of dollars, or would you rather that we invested that money in high-speed internet here and free public college here and infrastructure here? I would say, let's make sure that we leave. But they would say, if Al-Qaeda reemerges, America reserves the right to strike. And it would be foolish for the Taliban to make that mistake a second time and underestimate American resolve. They would face the same consequence that they did after 9/11.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today here on Bold. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.